In the wilderness, searching for the lost, you might just stumble upon something far more terrifying. This world is a strange one. It's all too easy to get lost or to make a clumsy misstep and end up somewhere you shouldn't be. Our planet is huge. There are forests and caverns all over the globe, completely untouched by people. Places where man turns a blind eye. These are the locations where people disappear. Sometimes they're found, usually dead in the strangest circumstances. Others are never found, left to horrific, unknown fates. So tonight, I'm going to share with you 5 allegedly true search and rescue scary stories. But first, if you want to hear your story on this channel, I'm looking for creepy stories from paramedics and firefighters. Any sort of first responder. If you've got a story, send it to us at deathbyfear.com. Now, I hope you didn't forget to bring a map, or else we might get lost in these stories. Number 1. My Volunteer Brother, submitted by Ingenix67. Before my older brother Gregory passed, due to complications not concerning this story, he was an avid volunteer in many different practices. He volunteered at our local junior high whenever they hosted a Special Olympics. He often went down to the shelter to help serve food to the homeless. I wouldn't call it a soup kitchen because we served sandwiches around these parts. Many people thought of my brother as a good person, and I would most certainly agree. As his little brother, I don't remember many negative moments with him. He never started fights with me. I'm sorry to say that any fights we did have, I was usually the one starting them. Always something about what he had that I wanted. I had a bit of a gimme streak as a child. Well, Gregory once had what he called an experience of a lifetime. It happened when he volunteered to be part of a search party for a missing child in the nearby woods. Now, this forest surrounded our little community. We live in the suburbs, and I grew up in a small backyard overlooking an intimidating tree line. I was always scared of those woods. Even when my mom told me to stay away, there was no need to tell me once. I wasn't going near those trees. But a younger child had a different idea, because a little boy went missing in the forest just beyond his home. He had been gone for about 3 hours by the time we got out there. The parents were panicking, and the police and firefighters worked together to search the forest. They welcomed any and all volunteers who were able. Of course, my brother jumped in without hesitation. They gave him an orange vest, so he was easier to spot in case he himself got lost. Then he went in, and my parents and I waited at the edge of those woods in suspense. My father would have joined him, but he had a very bad heart murmur, and he was currently at leave from his work until he had work done for his condition. Anyway, I watched my brother walk into those woods, confident and eager to help. We waited there for maybe 2 hours before we needed to go home to get my dad back indoors and to get some food in our bellies. Before we left though, we texted my brother to let him know to call us when they were done. Hopefully they would find the boy and we could drive my brother back home in no time. Midnight that same night, we stayed up for my brother. Altogether, he had been gone for about 8 hours now, and we were already beyond worried. But the door opened at the last minute, and we all got up to greet Gregory. We had questions to ask, and we needed to know if he was okay. Well, everything seemed off. I mean, my brother isn't the type of person to ignore texts. He never called for a ride though. And when we asked him how he got home, he simply said, "I walked." He stood there at the front door. He was quiet, and he wouldn't look any of us in the eyes. Something was wrong with Gregory. Not once in my life had I ever seen him act like that. After warming some food up in the microwave, he carried his late dinner to his room, shut the door, and he did not come out until evening the next day. And only then did he come out to eat again. We tried our best to get answers from him, but he was just blatantly ignoring us. My mom was worried, and my dad was sort of pissed. I don't think any of us really knew how to handle this situation. Gregory was never a problem child, and I could tell that my parents didn't know what to do. We ended up getting most of our answers from the news, which my mother watched avidly until we had updates on the missing boy's story. The boy hadn't been found just yet, and the police were still investigating. "That poor family," my mother said under her breath as she continued to watch the report. But I was honestly more worried about my brother. I figured if he didn't talk to our parents, then maybe he would talk to his little brother. It couldn't hurt to try, right? I knocked on his bedroom door, but there was no reply. Being a stubborn kid, I checked the doorknob, and it wasn't locked. I walked in and saw him lying on his bed, facing the wall. He obviously heard me walk in, but he didn't seem to care. I made sure to close the door behind me, and then I sat down in his little oval chair. "What happened out there?" I asked him, but he didn't say a word. I persisted though. "Gregory, talk to me. What happened?" I was both curious and worried. It was hard to hide those feelings in my voice. "We didn't find him," he said in a monotone voice. "We know," I replied. "We just saw it on the news." "We found parts of him, though," he said in that same emotionless demeanor. Parts of him? My stomach turned at the thought. What had my brother seen? He continued, though. "Blood. Pieces of meat, that's what I saw. Around the same area where he had entered the forest." Then he began to sound more emotional. He was only 4. Then he sat up in his bed and faced me. "That boy's parents must be devastated. Either that or they're in denial. I wouldn't blame them." He stared down at the floor and said one more thing. "What the hell is in those woods that would do that to a child? We grew up here, and I've never seen something like that happen." I was stunned seeing my brother like this. I didn't know what to say, so he turned, laid down again, and remained silent for the rest of the night. The boy's body was never found, and eventually my brother came out of his state of trauma and depression. He was someone who wanted to help more than anything, but he walked into those woods only to see the gore of the person he was supposed to save. It was hopeless from the start. The weird thing is, we've never had as much as coyotes in those woods. So it really makes me wonder, what happened to that child? Who or what took him? What was it that tore the boy apart? What scares me the most, to be completely frank with you, is the idea that whatever did this is still out there. Number 2. I Was Lost in the Woods. Submitted by BRUNDONBARNS. A long time ago, I experienced the most horrifying thing. It was something I wish I could take back or unsee. Something that I didn't think I would have ever gotten myself into. My family went on a camping vacation to the Ouachita National Forest about 10 years ago. I was a child back then, and a very curious one at that. My poor parents were always having to tell me to stay close to them and to stop wandering off. Whenever we'd go to Walmart, for example, I'd be gone in seconds, exploring all the items and goods in each aisle. Needless to say, I had plenty of good scoldings in my time, but my curious behavior stuck with me. But I know now, I should have listened to my parents. Anyway, the first day we went camping, after we'd set up our tent, my family and I decided to hike some of the trails in the area. The place was beautiful and breathtaking. Trees taller than life. I was having the time of my life just walking past the wildlife. There were birds chirping all around. It seemed like nature didn't care that we were there. It kept going with its own rhythm, the same as it did before and after we were there. The trails were longer than I thought they'd be, too. We were walking for 20 minutes and never once circled back or turned towards the camp. I was fine with that. There was so much to see. I had a hard time grasping just how big these woods were. I was young, and I didn't think so much land could be so uninhabited. During our walk, suddenly I heard the strangest bird call I'd ever heard. It reminded me of a whippoorwill, but deeper with a much longer duration, and at the end of the call the sound seemed to reverberate, or wiggle if I had to describe it in different words. The more interesting part to this sound as a little kid, it was the fact that it seemed to be coming from a bush on the side of the trail. I had to see this. I had to see this weird bird that sounded like an especially fat whippoorwill. I ran over to the bush, not thinking that I might scare it away, and of course my obnoxious steps forced something to fly out of the bush. It then flew into a bush maybe a dozen feet behind it. But I was determined. I tiptoed this time and continued toward that bush. I never saw it fly out of that bush though, but when I searched for it, I didn't see the bird anywhere. I searched the bushes nearby as well, just in case I missed it evading me, but still there was nothing. I gave up and decided to get back to the hike. Yet, when I turned around, I couldn't see the trail. Within what must have been 90 seconds at most, I had not only lost sight of my parents, but I'd completely lost the trail. Instantly, my heart began to go crazy, pounding in my chest at the thought of what I'd just done, of what might happen to me. The first thing I did was call out to my parents. They couldn't have gone far, right? Apparently, I was wrong. No matter how much I screamed, there was no answer. How could that be possible? Even if they were a mile away, wouldn't someone hear me out there? I soon found that I was crying uncontrollably, running in directions that I guessed were the correct ones, but all in all, I must have made my situation far worse. Maybe I should have just stayed put, I'm not sure. Everything around suddenly began to look menacing. No longer a dream world, the forest had turned into a nightmare. My nightmare. It had been 5 o'clock in the afternoon when we first set out on the hike, but hours must have passed by quickly, because before I knew it, before I wanted it to, the sun was setting, and soon I was immersed in darkness. This experience already sounds like a horror story, but what I'm going to tell you next will take a turn for the bizarre and unexplained. When I thought all hope was lost, the full moon suddenly revealed a figure in the distance, a silhouette that looked like a human. I was overjoyed. I was being rescued. Someone was there. Someone had found me. Whoever it was stood about 25 yards away. But then I heard them speak.
"Are you hungry?"
That's when my joy turned right back to dread, and fear filled my heart. Because the voice wasn't right. It wasn't a person's voice at all. It was this deep guttural grumble that somehow formed audible words. It spoke words, but didn't seem to understand what it was saying, as if it was only repeating what it had heard before. Then, whatever this was, it started to walk towards me. I turned and ran with all my might, but after all the crying and stress and thirst I had experienced, I was exhausted. Still, the thoughts of what might happen to me if that thing reached me, it pushed me past the pain. I wasn't even looking ahead of me. I kept my eyes on the tall, dark figure that seemed to be catching up fast. Suddenly, I was forced to a stop. I had run into something. I'd been running so hard that hitting whatever this was had knocked the breath out of me. I looked up. Standing above me was a man I'd never seen before. He shone a flashlight in my face. Slowly, I began to hear the screaming and calling all around me. People were calling my name. The man yelled out to the others, "Over here!" And footsteps began to rush toward me. I looked behind me, expecting that too tall silhouette figure to be only seconds away now, but it was completely gone. The trees were thin here, so there was no way it could have hidden that fast, but somehow it had vanished. I was reunited with a crying mother and a relieved father. They were handing me granola bars and a bottle of water, asking me question after question. They had been so scared, but I was fine, just mentally scarred was all. Then another man walked over to me. He had on some hiking gear and a backpack. He was very fit, and he had a very serious look on his face. He kneeled down in front of me and asked me a few things. Things like if I'd been hurt, and what had caused me to wander away from the safety of my parents. Then he asked me something weird. He asked me if I had seen anything. Now, I was a child, a scared child at that, so when he asked me this, I got nervous. I felt like I was in trouble for multiple reasons. I knew I would be in some sort of trouble for wandering off, but now this man was making me think that the figure that I'd seen wasn't supposed to be seen. So, feeling guilty for whatever reason, I lied to him. I told him no, that I didn't know what he was asking. But he went on to explain some things to me. This is what he said, as I've remembered throughout all these years. Always stay with the pack, and never be the last person in line. The moment you stepped foot on that trail, you were lost. It wasn't an accident. There are things in these woods that know how to take people. They know how to separate you without any trouble. When these things want you, there's no escaping it. You're lucky we found you. My mom and dad were beginning to look very worried that this man was speaking this way to a child who had just experienced the worst thing in their life. But I was intrigued and horrified at the same time. He stood up, saw my parents' confused faces, and went on. I've been doing search and rescue for the past decade, he told them. The stories I've heard, the things I've seen, sometimes I think it'd be safer to leave these forests to themselves. Then the man turned and walked away. It was the most mysterious conversation I'd ever had. To this day, I'll never forget what I saw, and I still wonder what might have happened to me if that search and rescue team hadn't found me when they did. Stay careful in the woods. That officer's words might sound crazy to most people, but now I truly believe, that there is something out there, and it does not have the best intentions in mind for us. Number 3. Haunted Forest. Submitted by Mr. Nowhere. I work for the National Park Service in a state I'd rather not say, because I know that when rangers share stories like these with too many people, it gets the wrong kind of attention. If anything, I want this quick story to be a warning. The woods are dangerous. I just don't want this to be an invitation for thrill seekers. I've been working with the National Park Service for about 5 years now. It's not very long in the big scheme of things, but it's enough time to have seen quite a few oddities. I've been on plenty search and rescue missions, most of which I'm happy to say end in success. People get lost in these woods, but most of them don't wander off too far. Then again, sometimes you get those people who don't stay put. Either they're young and unafraid, or they think they know what they're doing trying to save themselves after they've gotten lost. Well, on one occasion, a middle-aged man had gotten lost hiking some of the deeper trails. We'd been looking for him for 3 or 4 hours. The helicopters had already done several flyovers with no success. A coworker and I pressed on into the thicker woods, going downhill towards a small creek. Our thought was that maybe the guy went downhill trying to find water, only to end up getting more lost. Now, the deeper we got into that small valley, the more we heard these cracks in the woods behind us. This was never a good sound, because when sounds like that begin to follow you through the woods, it's something that wants to stay close to you. The sounds kept coming and getting closer by the second. Soon we began to hear what sounded like a dozen different sets of footprints around us. We didn't get a lot of sightings of wolves in the region, and when we did, it was usually coyotes or wild dogs mistaken as wolves. Usually all we had up here were mountain lions and the occasional bear. But this wasn't either of those. At that point, even I was assuming that a pack of coyotes or even wolves were stalking us. Then it got worse. We suddenly heard this screaming, blood-curdling screams like someone was being torn apart. They echoed throughout the woods and the mountains. I cannot say enough how loud this screaming was. I was sure that we had found the missing man. I was sure that by the time we got there, he'd be dead. We ran toward the noise, going full speed, ignoring the footsteps around us. Running so suddenly like that was sure to trigger the predatory instincts of whatever animals were stalking us. But we had to find this man, and if it came down to it, my coworker had a pistol holstered to his hip. After running for about 70 yards in the direction of the noise, the whole time the screaming never stopped, we stumbled upon a clearing, and we saw a figure bending down by the creek. The figure turns toward us, hearing our obvious presence as we came bursting through the trees. It's a man, middle-aged, sipping at the water in the creek. He stands up, walks over towards us, saying over and over, thank God, I thought I'd be lost out here forever." We asked the man if he was hurt, looking him over for any injuries, but to our amazement, he was completely fine. He wasn't hurt in the slightest, just thirsty and hungry. "Then why did you scream like that?" I asked him. He looked at me, confused. "Scream? I stopped yelling hours ago. My voice was starting to go for a minute there." "Well, didn't you hear that screaming?" my partner asked him. "What do you mean? I didn't hear anything. It was quiet here." "Well, until I heard footsteps bounding through the woods, and then there you were." My heart stopped flat. How could anyone in the entire valley not hear that scream? It sounded like someone was dying. There was whimpering in that scream. You could almost feel the pain and tears in it. How could anyone have missed it? We got the man some clean water. Then we got into contact with the rest of the team to get them to our location. Everything was smooth sailing from there. To this day, I don't know what that scream was. I've heard every sort of sound there is to hear in the wilderness. I've heard plenty of mountain lions and panthers in my time, but nothing sounds even remotely like what I heard that day. Even if you think I'm wrong, that scream lasted a good solid minute and echoed all over, never pausing or stopping for a breath. If it was a mountain lion, how could that man not have heard it too? Better yet, what was out there stalking us that night? Number 4. What My Cousin Saw, submitted by DIXIE. My cousin Jeffrey was the kind of guy who didn't leave home to go to the woods, he left the woods to come home. He was camping constantly. He'd often go to work after waking up in a tent by the creek. He absolutely loved it out there. Ever since we were kids, Jeff would always beg me to come outside to play with him, though he had a bit of a hard time breaking me away from my GameCube. So basically, all his life, Jeff lived out there. I think if it wasn't so dangerous, he would probably up and leave civilization for good to live in those woods. Once, Jeff was asked to be a part of a search and rescue party. You see, some kid got himself lost in those very woods, the woods that Jeff called home. So Jeff decided to use his experience out there to help out this kid. But he went about it all wrong. You see, Jeff thought he was doing the right thing by splitting up from the group to quote-unquote cover more ground. Because of this, he ended up completely ditching the group, looking for the kid throughout the night. Even though after about 4 hours or so, the group had found the child, yet they had no way of getting in touch with Jeff to tell them that the search was over. He had good intentions, but he could be a bit hard-headed. Well, as Jeff searched the forest that night, he soon found himself surrounded by weird noises. He said it sounded like howling, deep, low, and slow howls. He was used to hearing coyotes. Most nights he'd fall asleep to them howling at each other and making the dogs in the nearby town bark. But whatever was howling that night, it was definitely different. It didn't sound anything like a coyote. Not to mention, he had gotten himself deeper in the woods than he was used to. He'd been calling out the boy's name, but these howls got him spooked, and he was afraid to make too much noise. He began to feel like he was being watched, and he saw silhouettes moving between the trees. By then, he had turned back towards town. He felt that if he stayed out there any longer, he'd be putting himself in danger. It didn't take long for him to start seeing the eyes, yellow, reflecting eyes all around him. The worst part, though, was apparently that these eyes were at his eye level. These animals, they were tall, whatever they were. He felt that he had no other choice than to run. He heard steps around him in the woods, but he ran harder than he'd ever run before until he was out of breath in the middle of a road. Ever since then, he hasn't gone that far into the woods again. He still camps though, he just doesn't go without the gun he bought after that experience. I know Jeff, and I've never seen him as afraid as he gets when he retells this story. And number 5. My creepy search and rescue story. Submitted by Danielle D. I had this experience when I was very young, and it has certainly left a massive impact on my life. I was 16 at the time of this story. Now, I'm about 5'4" and 100 pounds, and I've been walking and hiking all my life. I live in a remote farming village in England, and for the most part the place was boring and dull, but one of the things I enjoyed the most was getting to join the local search and rescue unit. I enjoyed learning and helping people, and it gave me something to do besides going to school and coming home. It was there that I met my one and only friend. Let's call him Luke. He was a lad at the school which every girl drooled over, but I never saw him as that. He was about 6.5 feet tall and a major gym nut who loved playing tricks on me. It was the middle of summer and I'd been at the search and rescue headquarters all day studying maps of the local area. My eyes were beginning to ache, so I took a break and went over to the soda machine to get a drink. I was about to sit down to have a drink when we got an emergency call over the radio that there had been a missing couple who had last been spotted going over Devil's Canyon, which is the most dangerous place and is only for advanced hikers. I should know, I was out there before and I ended up breaking my arm. We geared up and then we had a briefing, and we were all out there in 25 minutes. Luckily for us, they had left their phone on, so we had the local police trace the call. My father wasn't too happy with me going up there. He's the chief of police for our town, and he gave me a very stern warning to stick to the group. When we finally reached the hills, it was dusk, and we were burning daylight. We took the north route that set us through the backbone of the hills. We had been for an hour walking and scanning our flashlights in every direction, every valley and behind every rock. Yet still there was nothing. I was starting to panic, and I was praying that we would find them soon. Darkness had now fallen, and we were surrounded by dark, looming hills. I stepped up to look at the waterfall where teens like to gather and drink beer, but still they weren't there. The wind seemed to pick up as I headed back down. I hurried to catch back up with the group while I pulled my hoodie tighter to my body. I wasn't worried. I had studied and walked the whole of this path a million times, so I never felt scared or frightened. The worst thing we had out here really was foxes. They might jump out of nowhere, but they would instantly run away from you. I found a stick along the path. I took it with me to help me traverse the terrain. I figured that the group must have been waiting in the clearing up ahead, so I made my way, and I was surprised to see that all the usual dead debris that littered the ground had been removed. The whole area had been cleaned. This was strange because no one was supposed to interfere with anything like that. We were supposed to let nature take its course. For example, if a tree fell in the forest, you're not supposed to move it, unless of course it's blocking a road or trail. But as I got closer, I could see a faint glow of a fire, and then I saw a clear circle had been made into the ground. Stones had been placed around the fire. I didn't see anyone around, and it was illegal to leave a fire burning unattended in these parts. In fact, doing so, there would be a heavy penalty. I was distracted by this, and I was considering calling it in, when I had something break me out of my thoughts. I saw movement up ahead through the trees. I saw 4 figures, all wearing dark green hooded robes. They were walking, but as they walked they swayed left and right, and they seemed to be muttering, but they were too quiet for me to hear exactly what it was. I froze. I couldn't run. I raised my walking stick in front of me, as if this tiny little stick would somehow save me from these men, but I didn't know what they wanted from me. Just as I came to my senses, I felt a very gentle tap on my shoulder. I turned around to see an older, middle-aged gentleman smiling down at me. He had the most perfect teeth I'd ever seen. They were brilliant white, and he spoke in a soft, low tone. "Why, hello there," he spoke. "My friends and I have been wondering where you were. We've been waiting on you." I froze. I didn't know what this man was talking about. I'd never seen him before in my life. I would have especially remembered that smile of his. I tried to sound brave and say stay the heck away from me, but instead I ended up stuttering it out. This made him grin ear to ear even more. Then he said something else. "We've been waiting for a girl who's young and pure, who needs to be taught some amazing lessons." He just wouldn't stop grinning. I felt sick to my stomach. He reached out to place a hand on my shoulder, but I screamed and I kicked at him. I think I hit him in the knee, and then I took off running. I didn't know what he was talking about, but he gave off the worst vibes. I sprinted down the slope of a river. I slipped and grazed my knees, and I stood there in the water until I heard the chanting getting closer and louder. And soon I began to hear movement at the top of the slope I had just come down. I picked myself up, my knees shaking as I tried to move. I knew every turn and every path, but they were fastly gaining on me. I was panicking, but then I recognized the place I was in, and I suddenly knew where to go. I was able to retrace my steps that led me back to the beginning of the trail. Just as I turned the corner, I saw blue flashing lights and my father leading a group of officers up the steps. I jumped at him, overjoyed to see him. All I could mutter out to him was that there were bad men up there, that I didn't know what they wanted to do to me. I buried my head into his shoulder, and he sent his men ahead. He stroked my head and calmed me down as we walked down the hill. When we reached the bottom, I calmed down enough to tell him what had happened. I sat at the back of his police car with my dog Arthur. He was a retired police dog, a German Shepherd, and he made me feel safe and protected. Well, I'm sad to say that they didn't find the men that I saw that night, but they did find a bit of torn green material from their robes, and they saw the place they had set up because they left the fire there to burn out unattended. When I was old enough, I moved away from that area. I've got my own family now. I ended up with Luke, and we have 2 beautiful sons, and I still will never leave his side when we go on walks. Humans aren't all-knowing or all-seeing. We might have a universe of knowledge at our fingertips. We might have eyes everywhere all over the world. Even still, there are things around us that we don't understand. And there are things in the forests of this world that elude us still. We might never know what's out there, but one thing is certain. There is, beyond a shadow of a doubt, something in the forests of this planet that is taking people. And there are other things out there that wish to do us harm. Good night. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And don't forget to send us your paramedic, firefighter, or first responder story soon at deathbyfear.com. Thanks.